Hello, welcome back to another episode of Somewhere Between a Film and TV podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Parra, and number one, thank you so much for listening and watching. Number two, if you could please down below, like, comment, subscribe, do everything you gotta do. And what did you think of The Smashing Machine? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Or are you somewhere between on it? I wanna know, I wanna talk about it. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on. Yes, The Smashing Machine, just so everyone knows, everything we review here will always have full spoilers. Granted, this is based partially off a documentary as well as, real life material depicting the importance of Mark Kerr and I'm blanking on the first name, but Coleman as well, and their sort of impact on the beginnings of the UFC, what they contributed, why they were important. And completely honest here, I would say my association with knowing the sport is very limited. I love sports movies, but in terms of just sports generally speaking, my knowledge about that is definitely a lot on the lower end when it comes to comparing to what I know about movies. But I will say I know a fair amount about sports movies, and I also don't mind the unconventional biopic, especially lately, because just right before this, they were playing the Bruce Springsteen biopic trailer, which, don't get me wrong, it looks like it's well crafted, but it's also one of those things where you're kind of like, man, how many of these sort of standard kind of 3-act things are they going to make? Maybe it'll be different. Maybe it'll be very good for all I know. I liked the Bob Dylan musician one a lot. But back to this, I, going into it, have been a tumultuous, is what I would say, fan of The Rock. I think that he has a lot of potential. I think him as an actor, whenever he really puts his effort into something, which I gotta say has not been, in my opinion, since Pain and Gain. I like his performances in the Fast and Furious movies, but that's more of him playing up a specific kind of role that he really decided to trade in for a while there. So there was that whole announcement about this whenever first it was initially coming out, that they were like, they posted the Instagram thing, you see that it's Dwayne Johnson, and you're like, yes, finally, is it going to be one of those Oscar role performances? That's kind of what they're leaning more towards the marketing for this as. And so you go into this, and you heard that it had a 15-minute standing ovation at a film festival. That's wild. That's always been interesting to me whenever you hear that, because you're like, whenever you actually go, do they time it? Is it really like that? I'm very curious how on earth they get them to be that long, but that's besides the point. I would very much like to be at one of those just to see. I don't think I could clap for that long. How on earth does that work? But moving on to the movie itself, it was entirely based off the marketing of the fact that Dwayne Johnson, not The Rock, Dwayne Johnson is kind of pivoting in his career a little bit. And part of me wonders if he was sort of doing that because of the most recent movies he was in not doing amazing, especially with something like Black Adam kind of tanking the DC universe, and they had to start all over due to that as well. And then stuff like Red One, the one that from last year, I get Red One and Red Notice confused. He's in both of them, and one's a Christmas movie, but they're kind of interchangeable in their quality to me. But going into this, you're like, okay, finally, let's see what he has, and let's go ahead and answer what I think of it really quick. Did I love it? Did I hate it? Or am I somewhere between on it? Well, this movie's interesting to me because I think it's very well made. I think it's even very good, but I didn't quite love it. I think I would say I'm somewhere between because I liked it a lot, but I liked it a lot because it's entirely anchored by the performance by Dwayne Johnson. Got to answer it right off the bat. Yes, he's great in it. He's really great in it, honestly. I think that this performance could have been even showier than the type of acting he chooses to do. He's very methodical and quiet in this movie, and he's very kind-hearted. The person that he's playing, Mark Kerr, is very kind of soft-spoken. He's gigantic, of course, but he has a very gentle nature to him. He's also very kind of, I wouldn't say shy. It's more like just a gentle sort of force of nature to the people around him. And he does kind of have a lot of issues as well that I think the movie could have shied away from but chose not to. He has some issues with Emily Blunt's character that I'll get into, but the overall narrative that the movie chose to go with is both one of its greatest strengths and probably one of its biggest kind of weaknesses too. Is, like I said, I thought this was very good, and it chose to go for this almost kind of documentary, very naturalistic style. There's next to no flow in terms of having a 3-act structure. Not that you need one, but I feel like any kind of pitfalls, any kind of trappings that a sports movie would have gone through in terms of having cliches being portrayed, it decided to remove them all. But then, by removing them, the movie itself kind of has next to no sort of gradual pacing into the next big thing, the something else. Instead, it sort of played like the documentary of Mark Kerr, the life of Mark Kerr for these, I think it's 3 years, and the sort of behind the scenes of his contributions to his impact on the sport. When it first starts off, I want to say that I really like the look of the movie. It even aids to its sort of 80s documentary style. Well, it's late 90s, but it's got this very kind of specific grain that you would find in what I would feel would be home video. And it even starts off just like that with the kind of like shaky cam in it. And this is directed by Benny Safdie. I want to point that out immediately, that this is directed by Benny Safdie of the Safdie brothers. And they've made like 2 of my favorite movies ever with Good Time and Uncut Gems. And part of that force of nature, of that really sort of unpredictable uncomfortability of both of those is in this, but not to the extent that you would think. This movie moves a lot more languid than I think you would expect from the Safdie brothers, just in terms of their previous directorial efforts. And here, what he kind of keeps, though, is that sort of uncomfortable nature of conversations between Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's character, Mark Kerr, and Dawn, played by Emily Blunt. I think that this movie, going into it, the marketing for it, I mean, it is what it is. It's definitely not selling anything that it's not, for sure. But the movie is way more about domestic drama than I think it is anything else. And I think it is about the sort of life he was living and the impact he had around maybe even just the couple of people like in his circle that he surrounds himself with. But Emily Blunt and Dwayne Johnson's characters, real life people, just were not good for each other. And I think it's a dissection of this sort of back and forth that they both have, this unhealthy relationship that they have that's at the crux of this. I think that this movie kind of in disguise is more about, because they're not married yet at that point, and I think it's a bit more about domestic issues than it is even about the fighting aspect of it, which I think is an interesting take. I think that is something that you're able to do. It still cuts to the fights. The fights, of course, are still important. They're still in this, but it's also about the back and forth that they have with each other and the unhealthy relationship that they're trying to sustain, and it's just not working for both of them. And I think that this movie ends up being a bit more about a character dissection and a character study about Mark Kerr's life. And I'm not sure how much of it's fictionalized, how much of it's real, that he is as a person. I think that instead of really following a specific kind of 3-act structure, I think what the movie chooses to do is it dissects the kind of slice of life problems that Mark Kerr had while he was fighting in Japan and while he was also kind of trying to get his life together. Because when we're introduced to him, he's addicted to opioids. He can't stop taking them, which I found really fascinating. But since the movie does so much in a very unstructured manner, it feels really shaggy. It feels a lot like this is just a lot of segments of his life, and they connect, kinda. I think that since the movie chooses to be primarily about Mark Kerr just kind of going through the paces of his life instead of, let's build up to the match, let's build up to this, to that, let's build up to the grand big fight that ruined our relationship or whatever it is. That stuff's there. It hits some of the beats, but it does so in such a non-traditional way that the movie almost kind of suffers from it because of it. I think that if it was just a bit more, and I think I'm a bit more all over the place myself here because usually I go through the positives and the negatives, but I think since the narrative is so kind of weaved in with the back and forth of it, like I think that a scene in it will be so great. And then it'll kind of hard pivot and then be about something else for like 20 minutes and then move back to being about something else again. Because early on, it's established that it's going to be about one of the earliest interactions that they have that I thought was really fascinating about Mark Kerr is they start asking him a question whenever they're doing the pre-fight questions, all that stuff, all the paces that they go through. And they ask him, what would it feel like if you lose? And he was literally kind of like, well, I'm trying to contextualize your question, I'm trying to internalize it, but I don't know how I would react because I've never lost before. And that reaction, the whole scene and the acting, I find really fascinating because The Rock does this thing with his eyes that there's so much eye acting going on with him in this that he kind of like looks like he really is contemplating it. He is doing the like dead stare off into space thing, but the character Mark Kerr is also so kind of gentle with how he speaks to other people that it doesn't even seem like he takes offense to it. It just seems like he's genuinely like, I don't know. I don't know how I would react. And then his actual genuine reaction, because you are curious, once they set up that plot point, you're kind of like, well, I kind of want to see how you'd react too. And so it does set that up. And then what I really liked here was him and Emily Blunt's relationship does put a strain on how he is in the context of the matches. I don't know if they're trying to imply that it's all her fault because she's like prompting these fights in the first place. I think that it chooses to go out of its way to also show sometimes that Mark Kerr is not necessarily in the right either 100% of the time. Don't get me wrong, there's an argument towards the end that that's like 1,000% not the way it should have gone, but I'll get to that in a second. But I did think that the way that they chose to portray their arguments, it felt very realistic. I think that the movie's pacing, it chooses to kind of put you to be a fly on the wall. And I can see that testing some people's patience as well. For me, I was definitely, for the first part of it, I was kind of like, what is this movie doing? And even if you get it and you don't like it, I get that as well. But I think I ended up kind of being fascinated by just sort of like watching these characters be portrayed by actors, but also kind of feel like they were so naturalistic. This movie chooses to go for naturalistic performances, which is where I think it's supposed to sort of like feel like, yes, this is real. Like these are characters they're real people, and we're not going to dramatize any of this. There's no like big moment that's like, oh, this is the big thing, and then it's like a show-stopping moment. I think that instead it goes for much more of this really handheld, intimate feeling as well, especially one that's marked towards the end that I'll talk about. But really focusing in on this with their arguments, I think that the movie, the way it portrays it, it's not like it's like, here's this big argument that ended our thing. There's a lot of really tiny internal things that starts off from even the first scene with each other, where she gets his smoothie wrong because he switched to whole milk instead of skim milk. I assume that's because he's bulking. And he kind of picks it apart. He's like, how many bananas did you put in here? She's like, oh, I put half a banana. And he's like, oh, you're supposed to put 1.5. And then he just dumps the whole thing out. And then they're already having this previous kind of, I wouldn't call it an altercation, but this previous disagreement about having the cat on the couch as well. And then these things just mount. They keep happening. And then by the time they get to their big argument at the end, you're like, no, this was earned. I think that this is valid that this would get to this point, because they do a lot of like not addressing the issue at hand. They kind of like talk about it, and then there's no, oh, I'm sorry for doing that. But it's a lot of like, I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry that you think this, because they even have this argument later where he's talking about, he ends up being really kind of particular about so many different things, and it ends up also being like I said, it's much more of a study of their domestic relationship with each other. And there's this whole part where they're out by the pool and he's like, he spent this time trying to get sober, which is another thing this movie was about that I think it should have maybe tried to establish a little bit more of what it was doing. But I think that it also just felt really long just because of the way it was paced anyway. But one of the things that I noticed it was trying to do was depict that aspect of it. And I don't know if part of it was supposed to be that, oh, this is just like his fighting in the ring as well. Or maybe he separates this from part of his life, you know, outside, and then inside he's the ring. He's a completely different kind of person. But in there, he seems like he takes out a lot of his energy, a lot of that raw kind of anger in there, because there's a moment where he's like, it's a movie called The Smashing Machine, but he literally smashes a door straight in half. And you're like, yeah, okay, that guy's big enough that he could definitely do that. But I think that in that scene by the pool, he's trying to tell Emily Blunt's character that, like, why did you let this grow like this? I need this to be like the Roadrunner cartoon. And then he gets all particular about it and she flips him off, and you're like, okay, well, I do see where like the nitpicky side of him is coming from. But then that leads to Emily Blunt's character being like, I kind of miss when he wasn't sober because I felt like I had more of a role to take care of him. And it's all these back and forth conversations that they're having with separate people, where she seems to have one friend that's shown in the entire movie, and you kind of end up being like, okay, that's interesting. And part of me, since this is also Mark Kerr's perspective, I can't help but wonder if this movie is calling out its own flaw, or maybe calling out a flaw of his. There's a scene towards the end where she says, you don't know anything about me. And the way he stares at her, I'm like, to be honest with you, I don't either. I don't know a lot about her either. I know that she's like obsessed with him and she's kind of manic sometimes. And if that's the intention of the movie, to have that like that, then credits to it. But otherwise, it does feel kind of like a flaw, because you're also like, well, I don't know anything about Emily Blunt's character. I know that she is really well acted. I know that she is kind of overbearing to him, but that scene, the big argument where she ends up placing a gun against her head, is crazy. And then it's like this escalation argument, and all of a sudden she's like, no, because he tells her to leave. And you're just like, so much is happening at this point. And you're kind of like, okay, well, I think that this maybe could have been a bit more earned if we knew even more about her, maybe. But part of me also questions if that would be the smart choice, because maybe it is also from the perspective of Mark Kerr. But it ended up being a creative decision that I felt kind of confused on, because I couldn't really tell what we were supposed to think of Emily Blunt's character. You kind of end up being like, look, she kind of has to go. She's got to go. But you do also kind of sympathize with her just a bit. But then she ends up, the way she escalates the argument in the final scene, where she's like really ramping things up and she's getting really upset that he doesn't want to take her to Japan because they feel like, and he feels like, he can't focus while she's around. And she ends up saying these things that she's like, I do all this for you. And part of me is like, well, when? But I also know that we are following his perspective, but there also are scenes where it cuts to her. So part of me is also like, well, wait, but okay, so does she do this, or is she just like saying that? And it ends up just sort of you being like, maybe it's an unreliable narrator thing, but then I think it just ended up me kind of like questioning the movie itself. And I'm like, okay, maybe it's just a flaw that I have. I'm not really entirely sure. But I also really liked the relationship between him and his friend Coleman. I'm really blanking on the first name, but I think that the way that they interact with each other, that actor, who apparently is a real life fighter, also is giving a very authentic, very natural performance. And the way he is just feels like a real person. I know that these are real people that they're depicting, but the type of acting here is not showy at all. It's almost impressive just how much it's very kind of authentic and feeling, because the dialogue feels real, the acting feels real, the paces that they go through in terms of their movements is so authentic and so natural that it is one of those things where at the end of the day, this is kind of where you are going to the movie for. And it's the acting, it's the performances, and I think the performances are stellar. I think it just kind of gets kind of handicapped by itself because it takes a unique and interesting approach where it wants to do this sort of like documentarian naturalist style to match the performances as well. It really wants to be effective in terms of being a very fly on the wall-esque picture of sort of like a slice of life about why these people were so important, but then also kind of chooses to not sensationalize them, which I respect. I think is very cool. I think that it's giving them a very authentic 2 hour perspective of that without making them sensationalized, dramatized, just showing they're important in a very matter-of-fact way is a very smart idea, a very unique idea. But I think also since the directorial style sticks to that and it is very strong, it ends up kind of being its own downfall a little bit, just in terms of pacing and just in terms of you ending up feeling like you don't want to backhand it, but you also kind of want to be like, all right, well, maybe we could have sensationalized this just a little bit just so we can get really the point across why they were important. I thought it was really interesting that at the beginning of the film that they were talking about how the rules, they were showing it. I thought the fights themselves, notice how I have barely brought that up in this movie that's about fighters, was very, again, very natural in terms of how they wanted to show it. It felt very handheld, very kind of like, I like the crash zooms that Benny Safdie utilizes to really authenticate this documentary style. It reminded me like how they do Succession, where that kind of like has that own style going for it too. But that dialogue and that's way more Shakespearean, but this one was more like going for this natural approach. And I found that fascinating because the hits feel real. They feel like authentic, not just like they hurt. I mean, it looks like it, but they feel like, yes, you would see this in person. It would look just like that. And I think that, you know, The Rock comes from a WWE background, and then everyone else also comes from a fighting background as well. So they definitely know how to sell stuff like that as well. And I thought that those fights were really interesting. They don't go on for very long or anything, but they're very authentic in how they feel. And parts of it reminded me of Raging Bull a little bit, just in terms of the behind the scenes aspect of the struggles from a fighter's daily internal life. And what I found really interesting about it as well, and that I thought this movie was going to focus more on this, and maybe could have, was the whole opioid addiction aspect of it that I told you I would talk about earlier on, which I found very kind of, I would say it was interesting while it was on screen, and you're like, okay, an addiction drama, that makes sense. We can watch that. And then it's only that for about 20 minutes and then pivots to something else and something else, which I was kind of at the end of the day sort of like, I think that each individual segment that is about what it's about is very interesting. It's all very good. But I think that when it comes together as a whole, it's so loosely structured that you end up kind of being like, by the time it's over, I wouldn't say you feel underwhelmed. You feel more like, I think it's very good, but you end up being like, okay, well, it's over. I saw it. It was good. And then you walk out, you're just like, that's interesting. What I think is maybe, it takes a very, very long time for you to be like, okay, this is why they're important. But I think that the ending ends up being the thesis of the movie itself and why it was made. Obviously, you want people that, you know, like revolutionize the sport to get their just dues, which is, I think, is respectable. I think that's a smart thing to do. I think it makes for a very, very solid story. And the best part is at the end, when I believe we're following the real life Mark Kerr, and it shows that while the titles are happening, it's like him and Coleman, they revolutionized the sport. They were one of the earliest pioneers of it. And you like watch him doing a very normal day-to-day thing. He's going inside, he's parking his truck, he's going into a grocery store, he's coming out of a grocery store. He waves at us, he breaks the fourth wall, he says like, bye guys, thank you, and then takes off. And it's very like, the titles are like, we recognize so many people's names every day, and these two were the unsung heroes of this taking off in the first place, which I found a very unique narrative approach to just like cut to this at the very end. And it ends up being like, okay, so we saw all that to be like, okay, so this is kind of what the day to day of such an important person to this was like. and what he went through and parts of what he went through to get there. And one of the aspects that really stood out the most to me, just in terms of scenes like that ties into the narrative, is this one scene where Mark Kerr is putting the showers on himself while he's just lost because he can't move his body. And then it cuts to Emily Blunt and him having all these different separate arguments and then all of these things. And he like smiles to himself and then just puts his head back against the shower wall. And I found it very quiet and very effective. And just kind of like, okay, I see what this is. I see that he's proud of where he is and what he's done. And I like that a lot. I like that. I find it very interesting. I think that Mark Kerr also very early on has a really great introductory established scene where he's talking to this older woman and she's like, oh, that's the bloody thing that they're trying to ban. And she asks him, do they hate each other? Do you hate each other when you fight? And he's like, no, not at all. And there's even it's even underscored later whenever he gets into this huge argument with Emily Blunt. And then because he needs to focus, he's like, you don't care about what I do. You don't care about, I think he was trying to say that he's like, you care more about me as an idea than you care about me as a person, which again, that's another thing that I was like, this is so fascinating. If they could have focused on this even more, I think it's just one of those things where with this movie, I was like, look, what you have is so good. Maybe focus on some of the aspects a bit more. Maybe focus on Emily Blunt's whole thing, that she's like the way she is. Why is she? I don't really know. And maybe Mark Kerr doesn't even know. And I find that a pretty interesting narrative choice, but I'm giving it credit that I'm not sure if it is allowed to take. But I did find that kind of narrative choice fascinating. And I think that him as a character study, Mark Kerr, I think that it was very interesting. And I thought it was very solid in terms of its approach about it. But I think since it ends up being so distant from its own characters, you can't quite fall in love with it. At least I couldn't, because of its own directorial style. I think it's a really, really well-crafted movie. I think that its struggles are literally baked in to the movie itself, which is kind of like, oh, well, shoot. Well, what do we do from here then? Where it's kind of like, okay, well, it reminded me of how I felt about Dunkirk, which I was like, I think is a perfect movie that I don't necessarily like love because it's so distant from its own characters. Here, it's kind of like a similar thing, but I think it's more that it's like, here's them going through their life. And I'm not saying that it should have been something else. I'm just telling you what we got, which I thought was a very interesting character study that maybe could have dug into its own characters just a little bit more in order to fully understand where they came from and why we should really be in love with them. I came away with it being like, I like these people a lot. I like these performances. I think that Emily Blunt's character and Dwayne Johnson's character are not good for each other. And I thought that was interesting. I just thought there were so many elements that I was like, this is great. And then it would dig into it just so deep and then like not further it. But I don't want to make it sound like I'm like harping on this movie because I liked it a lot at the end of the day. I think it's gorgeously shot. I really liked its like sort of chintzy kind of really, how do you describe it? Tacky maybe, since like the lights are so kind of glittery. And I liked the performances a lot. Also, I love the gym myself. So anytime a workout scene is ever shown, I'm like, hell yeah. But that the performances are so beyond impressive with their really naturalist approach. They're not showy. And I think that The Rock going for a performance like that, Dwayne Johnson, is more impressive than if he were to go for a showy role. But let's go ahead and wrap up my thoughts. I thought it was very good. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. I'm not fully in love with it due to its own nature, interestingly enough. But I think it's very, very well made. I think it does a great job with performances and it's very well directed. I really just can't say that I love it, which I will say, though, I loved Dwayne Johnson's performance. I think he's incredible in this movie. And see Pain and Gain if you haven't. I think he's pretty underrated in that and giving a very good performance. That's showy. That's the good kind of showy, though. But what did you think of The Smashing Machine? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Or are you somewhere between on it? I want to know. Up next is Tron Ares, but I will be out of town going on vacation, so that Video is going to get to you a little bit late, so I'm sorry in advance for that, guys, but stay tuned. And while you're at it, click on some of the other videos. Just reviewed One Battle After Another last week, the best movie of the year, just saying. And again, what did you think of The Smashing Machine, directed by Benny Safdie, starring The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, Emily Blunt? Do you think that he's going to win an award for it? I definitely think that maybe he should get nominated. I think that this movie was very good, and he's very, very great in it. It wouldn't work without him in it, that's for sure. But thank you guys so much for listening and watching. Please subscribe, comment what you thought. I'll see you next time.